Hi, and welcome to these advanced courses in land use regulation for Florida County Commissioners. I'm Thomas Hawkins here presenting on behalf of the Florida Association of Counties Institute for County Government. These courses are a follow-up to the first courses in planning and growth management for Florida County Commissioners. And we're going to be using this document, which you should have a copy of. That's going to give an outline of the content of these advanced courses and be supported by what we're going to be looking at in the presentation today as I speak. Let's go ahead and get started. If you look through your document, you'll see that on page Roman numeral 3, we begin with a table of contents, and then on page 1, we begin with our substantive information. I want to begin by giving a little bit of a contrast between the kinds of information you learned in the first course and the kinds of information that'll come in these 3 subsequent advanced courses. In that first course, what we really talked about was how land use law affects your ability as a local government official to regulate land use. So it was kind of a playing field of what the law allows you to do. But we didn't really get into a lot of giving examples of what you could do or even of telling you what you should do. And that's really going to be the difference between where we were in that previous course than where we are in these advanced courses. We're going to look at some specific practices of planning or land development regulation that exist in the state of Florida and use them as very brief case studies to give examples to you of what you might do as an elected official in your own communities. Before we get to that, though, we're going to go through an introduction where I give a brief overview of land use regulation or land development regulation in the state of Florida. And we're essentially going to be looking at a history. And the reason that that matters is because what we regulate in land development today is partly a reflection of what our needs are today, but it's also really a reflection of where we've been in the past. In other words, the system that exists wasn't created in recent decades or even recent generations. We've been doing this for about 100 years, and as practices have grown and evolved, it's been iterative, building on what's come before. So looking at that history will give a much clearer explanation of where we are today and why we're there today. All right, so let's go ahead and get started. We've kind of gone through this agenda and touched on these points a little bit. The 2 substantive advanced courses that we're going to address today are Big Ideas in Planning and Planning Processes and Strategies. And they'll be the 3rd and the 4th parts of our presentation today. After that, this introduction and then our substantive discussion on history. To introduce myself, my name is Thomas Hawkins. Hopefully you remember me from the first course. I am an attorney and a professional planner. I currently work at the University of Florida, where I'm an instructional assistant professor in the Department of Urban and Regional Planning. I also have a lot of respect for what you do in your seats, and I know how challenging it is, everything from elections to actually being an elected official, because I served 2 terms on the Gainesville City Commission before I joined the faculty at the University of Florida. All right, so let's get started with our brief history of land use regulation. I'm going to start this story in the 1920s. And this is not really where the story of land use regulation in the United States begins. We were entering this arena before then, but 2 really big things happened in the 1920s that really set the template for where we are today. The first is that the United States Commerce Department under Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover, this is before he was elected president, authored something called the Model State Enabling Acts. These were not federal laws, right? They were drafted by the Commerce Department, not by Congress. These were templates that the states could adopt and implement as state laws, and would be state laws essentially giving local governments authority to plan and create zoning districts. One really strong lasting impact of the Enabling Acts is that they created a 2-tiered process for doing land use regulation. 1 is first planning, and 2, second, implementing those plans through land development regulations. And so in your community today, you have both a comprehensive plan and a set of land development regulations. The reason both of those documents exist historically, there's practical reasons as well, but historically the reason you have both is because these Model State Enabling Acts that the Commerce Department drafted over 100 years ago, or about 100 years ago, set that template for planning being a 2-step process. First you plan, then you implement that plan through land development regulations. Next, the Commerce Department's intent in creating these model acts became the standard of why we do planning the reasons behind doing planning early in that process of implementing land development regulations. And the real reason that Herbert Hoover wanted to do this was to protect private property rights, especially residences, from the incursion of incompatible uses. The idea really was to be able to take property and look at it more objectively as something that you could trade in the marketplace and that you could use in the same way in lots of different jurisdictions, essentially to make land more tradable and more bankable as an economic asset. The other big thing that happened in the 1920s, and that also comes out of the Model Acts, is the establishment of Euclidean zoning as the basic approach to land development regulation. Now, Euclidean zoning is a really funny name, and I've got this diagram here of some arrows and some angles, things that as a lawyer I thankfully don't have to deal with in my professional life. But Euclidean zoning is not about geometry. This has nothing to do with Euclid in the mathematical sense. That name comes from a 1926 US Supreme Court case called Village of Euclid versus Ambler Realty Co. And that case, we know something about from our first course in land development regulation. It established the fairly debatable standard. And if you'll recall, the fairly debatable standard is this highly deferential standard that we apply to local government's legislative decision-making that essentially says, as long as the local government action has a rational relationship to a legitimate police power interest, it can stand. And the local government, the courts will not second guess that local government action. But the other big impact of the case for land development regulation is the Village of Euclid, following the standard zoning enabling acts, used zoning or use segregation as the basic template for land development regulation. So when we talk about zoning, in most circumstances, we're almost always talking about Euclidean zoning, which is the idea of organizing a community through regulatory practices to separate different land uses from one another. That's the basic tool of land development regulation. A big reason is that that's the way the Model Acts did it. And another big reason is because in Euclid versus Ambler, the Supreme Court said it was constitutional, and it had really set the template for our regulatory approach to land development regulation. It's the way we've been doing this really since then in the 1920s. We didn't really start changing that until very recently, and this sort of the next phase in land development regulation that we'll talk about in a second. So let's skip forward from the 1920s. We've seen the template that was set by those Model Acts and by Euclid versus Ambler, and we'll fast forward to something called the Quiet Revolution. So this was the first big change in land development regulation that happened after Euclid versus Ambler. So a couple things happened in between, right? We had tremendous suburbanization in the United States during the post-World War II period. Lots of growth and development. We had federal programs that helped people get loans for single-family houses. We had a boom in construction of interstate highways. We even had the civil rights movement, which led to desegregation. It caused lots of social change and geographic change in American communities. And we really saw, most significantly, a boom in suburbanization, where people for the first time were not just living in either cities or rural areas, but we're starting to live in suburban areas surrounding large US cities. That was really a change in growth and development patterns in the United States. Coming out of that change, we saw a new burgeoning environmental ethic in the United States. And the Quiet Revolution reflects that. Several states began to adopt growth management laws that were different from the Euclidean zoning that we saw in prior generations. Whereas the Model Acts that the Commerce Department adopted really looked at land as a commodity, focusing on doing things like maximizing the value of that land, ensuring that lots were uniform and could be looked at objectively, and not having a lot of public policy concern for how people used land. With a shift in the late 1960s and 1970s, we instead started looking at land as a resource. And we were concerned with whether it was conserved, whether it was being used to maximize social values, and also really probably most significantly, whether we were using it in a way that reflected our environmental values. All of those were big cultural shifts that began then in the late 1960s and early 1970s. The name, the Quiet Revolution, comes from a document that was drafted by the Nixon administration by a branch in the White House called the Council on Environmental Quality, or an office in the White House called the Council on Environmental Quality, that looked at early states that were engaging in this practice and coined the term the Quiet Revolution based on what their collective actions were, folding this environmentalism into how states at a state level looked at land use and planning for land use. Florida was not one of the states that was looked at in that Council on Environmental Quality report. And the reason is simple. At the time, we did not have any growth management laws in the state of Florida, but that changed in the 1970s. This is a quote from John DeGrove, who's a Florida academic who's no longer living, but throughout the 1970s and subsequent decades was a real leader in establishing growth management in the state of Florida, being a national advocate for growth management throughout the country, but also as an academic and as a state employee. He was a secretary of the Department of Community Affairs, really worked on these issues. And John DeGrove said, whereas Florida didn't have any of these growth management laws at the time that the Quiet Revolution report was authored, we changed that really quickly. And now, by the late 1970s, we're leaders in the area. And DeGrove says the reasons for this are pretty straightforward. What I love about this quote is it could have been written this year, right? All these are things that the state is still working with. But he says, Florida is dealing with persistent crises with regard to water shortages, the destruction of sand dunes and shoreline, unregulated and unwise construction, the blocking of public access to long stretches of beach. Right? These are issues that in many counties and in many parts of the state are still issues that we're dealing with today. Whether you agree with some of his subjective analysis there, like unwise construction, certainly we know that people feel this way, and these things are currently happening in the state of Florida. These are not bygone issues, in other words. Whereas Florida adopted its first growth management regulations in the 1970s, we really refined them in the 1980s. In the 1980s, Florida adopted something called the Growth Management Act that had some really significant innovations. These are all things that we talked about in the first course, but I don't think that we attributed them to this specific law. So I want to touch on them really quickly. In 1985, the state of Florida said that local plans must be consistent with state law, and it set up a process for enforcing that concept that we call consistency. 2, that every local government development decision must be comply with that local government's comprehensive plan. And that's a concept we called compliance. These are very similar C words, so you might get consistency and compliance mixed up, but know that those in the professional context, those words are used to refer to these two ideas distinctly. And finally, that local governments needed to do financial planning for growth and development to make sure that infrastructure from water pipes to parks to roads needed to be in place when new development came online. That's a concept we called concurrency capital improvements planning. And it was born in the 1985 Act and refined in subsequent years. And these are still hallmarks of how we do growth management today, although as I'm going to get to in a second, they've changed pretty significantly. So in the 1990s, we had another shift that is probably as significant as the shift that's described in the Quiet Revolution document. And that is a shift in policy led by a movement called the New Urbanism, or the New Urbanist movement, that's also called smart growth. And I think amongst practitioners, people might see a distinction between New Urbanism and smart growth. But I think as lay people or as elected officials, you can really think of these ideas as very similar, very, very overlapping schools of thought. And really the big idea at the core of this is asking this question: what if Euclidean zoning creates more problems than it solves? This is a really great quote from a founding document for the New Urbanist movement called the Charter for the New Urbanism, that says the physical design of cities, that the New Urbanism is a philosophy of the physical design of cities, and it views disinvestment in central cities, the spread of sprawl, the increasing separation of people by income, environmental deterioration, loss of agricultural lands and wilderness, and erosion of society's built heritage. So this is a really far-encompassing list of problems, and the New Urbanism views these as one interrelated community building challenge. So that sprawl and environmental degradation aren't separate problems. They're symptoms of the same problem in how we're doing planning and land development regulation. The loss of agricultural land and failure to protect maybe historic districts or architectural resources are not separate problems, but are integrated problems, right? That's the core idea of the new urbanism, is that if we thought about how cities were shaped and how they grow and change over time differently, we might be able to address all of these problems holistically. That's the core of the new urbanism. That movement began really in the late 1980s and gained its footing throughout the 1990s. And it's really got two big impacts. One is that in recent decades, local governments have been adopting land use rules pretty different than the foundations of Euclidean zoning. We're requiring things like mixed use development, focusing on attributes of development like walkability, wanting street networks that are interconnected, developments that have a variety of different real estate products instead of being all multifamily or all single family, looking at a variety of housing types and even introduction of commercial development into the same development proposal. The second is that local governments are more likely to consider things other than just historical land use considerations when permitting development. For example, local governments are more likely to consider social and quality of life consequences of development decisions. That wasn't as commonly the case prior to the new urbanist and smart growth movement. Although those ideas and connections were known and were talked about, the new urbanism and smart growth really helped to bring them to the forefront from a local government perspective. Now we're getting recent. We're only 10 years in the past now, rather than looking at really far ancient history. 10 years ago, the state of Florida adopted something called the Community Planning Act that really rolled back a lot of the ideas that we adopted in the 1985 Growth Management Act. Sometimes folks characterize this 2011 Community Planning Act as repealing that former 1985 law. I don't think that perspective is correct, but there was a relaxation of a lot of the standards. So some of the things we talked about from that act, focusing on infrastructure provision, compliance, and consistency, those are all still the law. But the tools that require those things to actually happen, for example, the state enforcement or the ability to sit for citizens to enforce some of these provisions, those rules are less strong today than they were in the 1980s. So we really reduced state of Florida oversight, and we retreated from some of those compliance and consistency tools, although the law still does require everything that we looked at on that slide describing the 1985 Act. Where I would like to conclude this introduction, after looking at that arc and seeing how what we do today has been influenced by significant events in our history, what I want to focus on is this point. Your local government really is a lab for experimentation. You have lots of leeway, really even more leeway after the 2011 Act than you did before, to generate great ideas and to put them into practice. I think the only limitations on you doing great things and solving great problems in your job as a county commissioner are your ability to collaborate with your colleagues and stakeholders, both inside and outside of your county government. Really, the sky is the limit. And I think that long arc of looking at all the things that we've tried to do using land use regulation, and all those tools are still on the table, right? The quiet revolution is no longer the big idea in planning, but it didn't disappear. We're still concerned about environmental conservation. All those things are on the table and can support ideas of where you want to go as an elected official. And we're going to talk about those tools and give you clear examples of that as we go through our case studies and examples today. So that would be a place that I would pause. With that introduction, let's move in to start talking about some big ideas in planning. So coming out of that introduction, I want to talk about some of the big challenges that planners are thinking about and talking about today. So you may be hearing about a lot of these ideas from folks in the community, from folks on your staff, or they may be ideas that you want to pursue. I'll give a little bit of context for how they're addressed by professionals in the land development regulation field to really help you get some ideas or even research resources to start looking deeper into these things yourself. The first big idea in planning that I want to talk about is urban design. This may feel like a foreign concept, but I think that these next two pictures will be kind of a good indication of what I mean by urban design. The image on the left here in the foreground is downtown Gainesville. And then in the background is the University of Florida campus. And in the top left of that picture, you can see Ben Hill Griffin Stadium. What I want to point out about this picture is that walking from downtown Gainesville to the University of Florida campus all the way to the football stadium, even though it's about 1.5 to maybe even about 2 miles, is a pretty easy walk. There's lots of different routes. There's lots of roads without a lot of traffic. There's green spaces along the way. There's lots of things that make the walk functional, right? You can pass residences, homes, stores, of course, places that you would learn things, educational institution. It's really an area that's built at a human scale and serves a lot of different purposes. Now, compare that to the image on the right. This is a development in Gainesville called Butler Plaza in the foreground, and then in the background across I-75 is another development that wasn't quite built in the image here called Celebration Point. If you look in this photograph, it looks very, very different. The sizes of buildings related to one another are very different. The spaces between buildings are much greater. The size of roadways are much greater. The prevalence and obviousness of parking is much greater. The big difference between an urban environment on the left and a suburban or sprawled environment on the right relates to all these things: the separation of land uses, how many land uses there are, how easy it would be to walk between them. And in imagining yourself in each one of these positions, you would use them very differently. If you had to get from the foreground of the picture on the right to the background of the picture on the right, you almost certainly would not walk. Even if it was a nice day, great weather, you'd probably hop in your car to drive from one parking lot to another. And really the difference between those is not a function of distance, it's a function of urban design. So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are happening in the land development regulation that relate to urban design. So if you go to page 14 in your packet, you're going to see a tear sheet on something called Miami 21. Before we talk specifically about Miami 21, I want to talk a little bit about how these tear sheets are organized. You're going to see these for all of the topics that we talk about in these two courses. They begin with some basic factual information about what the issue is, telling you what county it's located in, giving a brief description of it and why it matters for this course. And then you're going to see a list of additional documents. Those are materials that folks at the Institute for County Government have that I've put together for you that range from very brief and probably interesting to incredibly long and boring. So those additional documents that I've provided aren't necessarily there for you to study in detail. They are there for you to use as a resource. For any topic that you find particularly interesting, you can go in and read those read more documents or learn a little bit more by looking at those read more documents, or even just seeing a practical example of what one of these regulatory documents looks like in practice. You can look at those read more documents. And again, some of them are so long, I haven't even read them in their entirety. They're hundreds of pages, but again, some of them are very brief, and they're provided for your use in whatever capacity is most useful for you. Then below that, in 2 columns, is a brief narrative description of the item or the case study. I'll go into similar but perhaps different information in this presentation than what's written there in the narrative. So this presentation should be very complementary, but not necessarily duplicative of what you're seeing in the packet. So follow along on page 14 here with Miami 21, but know that what we cover in the presentation will be a little bit different because, of course, the presentation is a different format. Well, so first of all, what is Miami 21? In the first course, we talked about something called form-based codes. This is a new approach to organizing zoning districts in a community that is very much an outgrowth of the new urbanist movement that we talked about in the introduction. Form-based codes are not wholly different from Euclidean codes. They are different in their policy emphasis and in the desired outcome. So we've got a few different components, but we'll see that they're pretty much analogous to things that we saw in Euclidean codes. So for example, form-based codes divide communities geographically up into different zones in the exact same way that Euclidean zoning land use codes do. What's different between them is the basis of that dividing up, the substantive distinction between the different zones. Whereas in a Euclidean zoning code, we're going to organize communities based upon the land use, for example, residential, commercial, industrial, and the intensity, for example, low density or high density. In a form-based code, we're going to be organizing the community based on the urban transect, which is how rural or urban the development is, but without focusing on things like land use. And I'm going to give some more examples of this in a second, but this is really going to be the focus of the next couple of slides, is what the urban transect is. So hold on if that concept doesn't make any sense. Next, the organizing principle of a Euclidean zoning code is to separate different land uses and intensities. We're really striving to avoid incompatible land uses being near one another, with the idea that different land uses like commercial and residential are not compatible with one another, and with the idea that a high density residential use is not compatible with a low density residential use. So in a Euclidean code, we're trying to separate those uses to make sure we do not have incompatible uses near one another. In a form-based code, the organizing principle really is about having an urban downtown and having rural land away from that downtown, and having a more or less seamless transition from that urban core to the rural outer area in gradations along that urban transect, again, which we'll explain a little bit more in a second. And then finally, and this is a really big distinction, is typically Euclidean zoning codes don't do a lot of regulation of the street network. They leave that to the Public Works Department to build and maintain those arterial roadways so we can get from development to development or subdivision to subdivision. Whereas in form-based codes, we take a much more holistic view, recognize that the nature of a street network and the character of streets has a lot to do with how livable a community is, how easy it is to get from one part of your community to another. So form-based codes are going to focus on the roadway network, probably with different standards for subdivision, and maybe something called a regulating plan that calls for new roads to be created as land is development in a gridded street network pattern, rather than as disconnected cul-de-sacs or dead-end neighborhoods that just lead you to a nearby arterial roadway. This is an example of the zoning code in the city of Miami for Miami 21. This is not the current code. This is the Miami 21 Atlas from when the city of Miami originally adopted its form-based code right around about a decade ago. I won't say the exact year because I don't recall without consulting my notes. It looks like a zoning map. This is not too different from the zoning maps with which you're familiar, whether you have a district with a form-based code or not. A big distinguishing characteristic is on the right-hand side. You'll see that the zoning categories all begin with the letter T. That references their transect designation in the urban transect. So what Miami 21 is specifically is a form-based code that the city of Miami adopted for its entire jurisdiction. At the time that Miami did this, no other jurisdiction in the country the size of Miami, and maybe no other jurisdiction at all, had a comprehensive form-based code or an approach to zoning based around the urban transect. Okay, so I promised we would do this. We would explain the urban transect in a little bit more detail. So here are some slides that do that. The concept of the transect, and I can't take credit for these diagrams. These were prepared by a firm called Dwani Plater Zyberk and presented to the Miami City Commission when it considered adopting the Miami 21 code. So this is their work product. I got it from a public records request from the city of Miami. This is their presentation, and I'm just reiterating a couple of slides from it here because they visually do a good job explaining these materials. The concept of the transect comes from ecology, and it's the idea that if in this top diagram on the left side, if you're at the ocean, you're going to have a certain kind of plant and animal that exists right at the shoreline. And as you move away from the shore, up sand dunes covered with sea oats, up the back of the dune, which might have slightly different plants, across a barrier island where scrub oaks might exist, all the way to an intercoastal waterway where you might have mangroves. You're going to see incremental transitions in the kinds of plants and animals and soil that exist. And ecologies call that variation a transect. Foot to foot or yard to yard, you might not be able to see a lot of difference in nature. But when you go even as short of a distance as the front of a barrier island, the seaside, to the intercoastal waterway side of a barrier island, it looks very different. A lot changes. And that's the idea of the transect, this incremental variation across space. A big innovation of form-based codes is applying that concept to cities. In this middle diagram, we've got a transition from a rural area all the way to an urban area of a city, which is there in the right-hand side of the diagram called urban core. So we've got, as you move from left to right, some of the key differences that you'll see in each of these little incremental diagrams is the street network becomes more formal on the right. It's less formal on the left. You probably have smaller blocks on the right. City blocks might only be a few acres in a downtown area, where they could be dozens of acres in a rural or suburban area. As you move left to right, you probably get bigger buildings. As you move left to right, you probably have an environment where there's more people walking or riding bicycles, right? Because it's more crowded, there's probably less parking. As you move from left to right, you're going to get more and more formal organization of uses, whereas on the left, they'll be segregated. On the right, you might have more integration of uses. So these are the kind of differences that would be reflected in how each of the zoning categories, T1 through T6, regulates the use of land. Finally, in that bottom diagram there, those are some photographs that that firm, Duane, Plater, Zyberk, presented to show how each one of these zoning categories exists in the city of Miami, as an example. They also provided this image to the Miami City Commission at the same time, showing that if you look at existing urban areas, or perhaps more traditional urban areas throughout the country, they point out that cities historically, before the advent of Euclidean zoning, grew in this way, with gradations between less urban and more urban development. And you can see images on the left, shorter buildings, more trees, more space between buildings, primarily residential structure types, to images on the right where we've got much more mixed use, much larger buildings, much less green space. And that is a transition from a more suburban to a more urban context. And again, the innovation in form-based coding is actually regulating for this outcome, rather than as a Euclidean code that regulates to segregate land uses and get much more the suburban, the drivable suburban development kind of product that we've been building, frankly, throughout the United States for the last 70 years, but really particularly dominates in the state of Florida because so much of our development occurred in that time period. So those are the ideas that I wanted to present about Miami 21. If you look in your additional materials for Miami 21, you'll see 3 documents. One is the original Miami 21 zoning code, which has been amended since that time, but I wanted to provide you with the original so you could get a sense of what that first document looked like. The original zoning map, which I also just showed you, but you can see in higher resolution. And then third and finally, that complete slideshow presentation that I just showed some excerpts from. All right, let's move on and talk about sunrail stations, which are a great example of something called transit-oriented development. And here we are looking at page 15 in your packet, where you get the short sheet on sunrail stations. So first of all, I want to talk about something that exists in the Seminole County Comprehensive Plan. For those who don't know geographically much about Seminole County, it is the county immediately north of Orange County. In Orange County, just below the southern border of Seminole County, is University of Central Florida. So a lot of growth in the southern part of Seminole County is development of employees or students related to UCF. Seminole County also has the northern extension, or a part of the northern extension of the Sunrail line, which is the commuter rail line that exists in Orange County. And a lot of the folks that use that line to commute are headed south into Orange County. In other words, there's a lot of the commuting trips originate in Seminole County. They don't terminate in Seminole County on the whole. I'm sure some folks are commuting to the north. There's the I-4 corridor also running north and south through Seminole County. And development is largely oriented on that north-south spine along those transportation corridors. Both to the east and the west in Seminole County, there's slightly less development than along that central core, particularly in the east part of the county where there's a lot of wetland and a lot of agricultural land. So what Seminole County did that's really interesting in its comprehensive plan, as planning was being conducted for the Sunrail line, it created an optional development approval path in its comprehensive plan to encourage development of greater density and intensity for development around the Sunrail station areas that met certain predetermined criteria. And those criteria were all related to creating something called transit-oriented development. Transit-oriented development is the concept that around areas with high quality transit services, we can build higher density development that encourages people to live near a transit station, walk as commuters to a transit rail line, and commute to their jobs without ever having to get in an automobile as part of their daily commute. So it's an idea that a really high quality transit line can actually spur private sector real estate development, and that folks can make use of that transit service without necessarily being automobile commuters first to getting to a station area and then riding somewhere. Instead, that first leg of their trip can be on foot. And you can have additional growth and development in your community without putting new cars on the road, because folks that live in those places for the majority of their trips will be walking. Now, in order to pull that off, you've got to do a couple of things really well. One is you have to allow people to maybe pick up their dry cleaning on the way home from work without getting in their car. So you need some commercial retail uses. Maybe they need to be able to, on the way home from work, pick up some takeout or pick up some items at a grocery store. On the way to the work, maybe they need to be able to buy a cup of coffee, right? So you've got to have some mixed uses in that station area so that those walks are useful. You also want to be able to have a critical mass of people living there and to make their walks comfortable. So you need to be concerned about the quality of sidewalks, the distance people need to go, and what kind of density there is. So one way that Seminole County approached that, in addition to the rules that I just described that exist in their comprehensive plan, where they give favorable development status to people who meet these criteria, is they actually did some physical planning on the front end for what they want station areas to look like. And these pages that I'm showing you here come from a document from public workshops looking specifically at land around all the station areas along the Sunrail line, not just in Seminole County, but including Seminole County, to give some ideas of what development could look like around those that would meet these transit-oriented development concepts. One other idea that I'll present before we go through these couple of images is to note that the idea of transportation infrastructure spurring private sector development is pretty much a no-brainer, but most of us are only familiar with it in the concept of building a new interstate exchange. But we know that if an interstate comes through an area around a interstate exchange, or any freeway, it could be a turnpike, not necessarily part of the interstate highway system, but that's where you get hotels. That's where you get maybe a regional mall. That's where you get fast food. So people have access to those things as they drive through because we get lots of traffic. The idea behind transit-oriented development is exactly the same, only the urban design and land uses are tailored to that transit use, which incorporates people having part of their path as a pedestrian rather than just being organized around those automobile commutes. So let's look at some of these images. This is one we're starting at the northern end of the county, and we're going to move south through the several Sunrail station areas that are in Seminole County. But this is planning for the rail line near Sanford and looking at what some different development typographies could be if there was development around that rail line. Here is another one for Lake Mary, moving south into Seminole County. Here is another one for the city of Longwood, again, moving south next Altamont Springs. Some of the common things that you'll see in each one of these images is that the buildings are built right up to the street line, are multi-story, again, to accommodate those needs of having, being able to accommodate a higher population in a place that's very walkable and convenient, which planners identify are necessary in order to have transit-oriented development be successful. All right, so those are all the ideas that I wanted to cover, talking about transit-oriented development and Sunrail stations in Seminole County. Really emphasize that one thing that makes that process unique is not only was there planning for those station areas, but it was anticipated ahead of time in the Seminole County Comprehensive Plan in order to make development of that kind of product easier and more streamlined, under the idea that it would allow growth without an increase in traffic and some of the other negative consequences that we see with new growth and development. Let's shift gears now and talk about South Walton. If anybody vacations in the Panhandle, you know that South Walton, or the 30A corridor, has a lot to offer, not just in terms of the beauty of the beaches, but in terms of the development product that's in the area. So if you look on page 16, you'll have a tear sheet there. I'm noting that I didn't highlight what were the read more options under the Sunrail stations. And I think it's probably worth it to backtrack and for me to just give an overview of those three documents before we get any further into South Walton. The three things that are there, let's just go back to this slide as our visual image while we cover it. The three things that are there are a Sunrail transit-oriented development workshop sketchbook. The pages that we're looking at now are excerpts from that document. Second, the TOD concepts for stations in Seminole County. Those, the full provisions from their comprehensive plan are reproduced there in the read more section if you want to read those and get a sense of them. The Seminole County, I'm sorry, that's the third item, the Seminole County Comprehensive Plan policies related to urban centers and corridors overlay. So those are the three documents that are available to you. All right, now let's talk about South Walton County. If you're following along, we are on page 16 in this book where the tear sheet is. So in South Walton County, prior to the 1980s, very, very little development occurred along the beaches in South Walton County, even though these were just absolutely gorgeous beaches. It's a really fantastic part of the state of Florida. And a couple of things have developed in that area that make it unique from other development in the state of Florida. These two images that I want to show are really fascinatingly different images, very much in the same way that the image I showed of downtown Gainesville versus the image that I showed of that big box sprawl on the west side of Gainesville are very different. These two images are very different. What we're looking at on the left-hand side is an aerial photograph from Google Maps of a development called Rosemary Beach. And when you look at this, it looks like a downtown, right? This could be the downtown of an historic Florida city, but it's not. This is new development, Rosemary Beach. It was designed by an architecture firm, actually Duane Plater Zybrick, which is the same firm that did that form-based code for the city of Miami. And it was built as a real estate development project in the last generation, in recent decades. Compare that with the image on the right, which is Panama City Beach in Bay County. And the differences are pretty striking. So for example, right along the coastline in the image of the right, we have very large buildings up against the beach with parking lots behind. Whereas in the image on the left, the biggest buildings are actually north of the 30A roadway, in the center of this image, not right along the shoreline. Another big difference we'll see is that there's a much finer grained network of streets in the image on the left. You see lots of blocks, lots of streets intersecting, lots of intersections, but the streets are relatively hard to see because they're pretty small, even though these are both taken at the very same scale. In the image on the right, we really only see two streets, one running north to south and two running east to west. One of the east to west streets is on the beach side, and one of the streets is north of the beach, north of the bay or intercoastal area there. Another big difference is that we can see distinct land use types. So in the right-hand image, you can see definite commercial. I'm not sure if my cursor will show up. You can see definite commercial around this intersection here. You can see this water park here. In this image, we can see maybe more urban, larger scale uses here, but no other real ability to distinguish between different kinds of land uses. It blends almost seamlessly. The image on the left absolutely is an example of a new urban style of development, whereas the image on the right absolutely is an example of a suburban style of development. If you're not appreciating the distinction between these now, you absolutely will with this next picture. These are the exact same two places, but with images on the ground. The picture on the left is a picture that I took of the sort of city center area of Rosemary Beach. It looks nice, lots of people out walking. What the big difference between these two pictures is there's people in the image on the left and there are no people in the image on the right. I joke with my students when I show them the image on the right that if that little girl from Rosemary Beach were biking along this roadway on the right, you would call the Department of Children and Families, right? Because clearly the parents were not taking responsibility for their child by letting them ride a bike on that roadway. And I'm being a little bit joking. It's probably easiest to address that situation with humor, that we have places that just aren't safe for children in Florida communities, but it's absolutely true, right? There's a clear difference between these two places, how comfortable they are to be in, how safe they are to be in, whether we have a rational expectation of seeing people. In the image on the right, you're not going to see people because they're not going to be on the road because it's just not a safe place to be. They're going to be walking in that catwalk to get from the hotel to the beach, right? Well, so let's talk a little bit about one of the impacts of that. To this point, we've been talking about the difference between suburban and urban development, largely on grounds that are social or ecological. When we talked about reasons for the smart growth in the new urbanism, we identified loss of environmental land or farmland, maybe some of the social impacts, public health impacts of having a sprawl development or that kind of community. We didn't really talk about economics. And what is so fascinating about Walton Beach is even though it is a place with some of the most gorgeous beaches in the entire world, one of its chief marketing statements that it presents about itself is that the development there is urban. Another development in South Walton, other than Rosemary Beach, is Alice Beach. And in advertisements for Alice Beach, they openly proclaim that they're an urbanist town. We are a new urbanist town on the pristine beaches of Florida's Gulf Coast. They mention that design character in their marketing first and foremost, even before their beautiful beaches. And what I want to draw from that is that this kind of development pattern can be an economic boon to a community. And I've got two examples for this here. I was not able to, in my research, find any peer-reviewed surveys making these points. And so I did what I can do in this presentation, but I might not be able to do for research in my role as an academic at the University of Florida. I called some friends who I know vacation in Rosemary Beach. Both are families that live in Atlanta. And I said, why do you go to Rosemary Beach when you could go anywhere in the state? When you could go to the Georgia or North Carolina beaches? Why is it that you go to Rosemary Beach? And these are the answers that I got. This person, Ton Mueller, said, it's beautiful, smaller and walkable, and it seems more private. What's interesting about that seems more private is that clearly if you compare those images of Rosemary Beach to Panama City Beach, the development is closer in Rosemary Beach, but it seems more private because that urban development pattern gives people a lot more of their own private space rather than being in a large multi-story building. And then emphasize the beauty and the walkability. Here's another person, Rachel Sloan, who's vacationing with her family in Rosemary Beach. Again, I cheated someone that I know personally, who emphasized how quaint and pleasant it was, and a preference not to have large parking lots or high-rise buildings. Especially Rosemary Beach was a better place to vacation with children. So there's an economic component of looking at this kind of development product as well. In your read more section, I have an interesting article about Seaside, no government reports, which makes this section a little bit more unique, but a bibliography that lists some books that are available about this relationship specifically between economics and the new urbanism, and then also that looks specifically at development in South Walton. These are 4 books about a development in South Walton called Seaside that was the first new urbanist development built there in the county, and is very well known and is publicly lauded for its success. These are some images from Seaside to kind of drive home these points of how design can be a key component of having an economically successful community. These are images from Rosemary Beach, more Rosemary Beach. This is the development Alice Beach that I mentioned that had that internet advertisement. And then finally, this is an aerial view looking of Rosemary Beach here. Sorry, of Seaside here, which was a development built in the 1980s, originally with very low cost per lot, although now it's very ritzy and very well known and very expensive to vacation here because of that design. It didn't begin that way. And then surrounding it is development that has the same design cues, but is not part of Seaside. Instead, this is all a development that was done by the St. Joe Company that emulates or attempts to emulate the successes of Seaside, although in separate developments, because it was a pattern that has been very economically successful. All right, transportation. In moving on to our next case study, we're going to be looking at a redevelopment of Gaines Street in Tallahassee. But before we look specifically at that case study, I want to talk a little bit about transportation generally. We often do not talk about our transportation system in the United States from its public health perspectives, but we really should. And as elected officials, you should. While your constituents day to day are probably most concerned about their commutes, about how they get to work, about how the transportation serves them on a daily basis, we also have an issue, as everywhere, but it's particularly acute in the United States, that our transportation system isn't safe. And I want to talk about that a little bit for a second. In 2019, and that's the last year that I was able to get complete data for when I put this presentation together, drivers killed a little bit more than 3,200 people in the state of Florida. It's a leading cause of death, especially of young people. And Florida is the most dangerous place in the United States for walking. An organization called, so I believe it's Smart Growth America, puts together an annual report on the safety of walking in American cities. And routinely, the most dangerous places to walk in the country are in the state of Florida. And their most recent report, 8 of the top 10 most dangerous cities for walking are in the state of Florida. And I want to touch on this picture for a second. I included it because that is a picture that I took right outside of the Florida Association of Counties offices on Monroe in downtown Tallahassee. Those small white signs are ubiquitous on Florida roads, so much so that we probably overlook them. So I want to give an example of a recent death that occurred in the city of Gainesville on January 16th, 2021 this year. A driver left the roadway and began driving on the sidewalk and killed and struck a University of Florida student named Sophia Lambert and killed her. And this is an image that came from the Gainesville Sun. And in Gainesville, this has been somewhat of a catalytic incident in raising our consciousness about how dangerous streets are, especially for people walking and biking. Certainly not the only person killed on streets even that month in Gainesville who was biking or walking when a driver killed them. But for a lot of reasons, the incident catalyzed how we thought about safety on streets in our community. And I know that these kinds of incidences are happening in your counties as well. And so I want to talk a little bit about some approaches to roadways that can maybe ameliorate some of these things. I'm going to talk about Gaines Street and some changes that the city of Tallahassee made to that roadway. If you're familiar with Tallahassee, in the downtown, the center of state government is located more or less on the eastern side of downtown, and Florida State University campus is somewhat located on the west side of downtown, with a neighborhood in between them. South of both of those is a railroad track running east to west. I'm not sure if the railroad track is still active. I know a rail to trail line exists there. And then south of that, literally on the other side of the tracks, is Florida A&M University. And as recently as a decade ago, that area looked like this image on the left here, largely industrial uses, a 4-lane roadway, and very poor pedestrian infrastructure. Today, that roadway, which is called Gaines Street, looks like the image on the right. Lots of multifamily housing, lots of new commercial development, a 3-lane road with wide sidewalks and on-street parking, and just a completely different urban environment that existed very recently, one that's much safer and more pleasant to walk in. Here's again some images, image on the left coming from the city of Tallahassee and the image on the right coming from Google Maps. These are from the exact location, just in case you didn't get the notice the difference. This building and this building are the same one. These are the exact same location, same intersection on Gaines Street. Likewise, this is the same intersection on Gaines Street. Not a whole lot happening in terms of economic development in the left-hand image, but the city redeveloped it into a new cross section, and lots of development is happening on that roadway in the right-hand image. Multi-story buildings, lots of activity, but interestingly, not nearly as much space for folks to drive. We don't see a correlation between how much space exists to drive and how much economic development exists. These cross sections are of the new roadway that the city put in and what it looks like in terms of its design. And lastly, I want to show you some financial impact that occurred from that decision. Again, even though these changes to the roadway resulted in a lot of safety improvements, it can be hard to quantify those. Even on a dangerous road, folks might not be injured every year or die every year, but we can look at the financial impact of property values or development permits pulled for development along these roadways very objectively and have numerical standards to look for. This, according to the city of Tallahassee, that roadway project had a $364 million financial impact of completed projects. At the time that this was written, there were $92 million worth of projects still under construction or underway for a total of $456 million. All of that, in addition to that, there's another $62 million in the pipeline, stuff that's not under construction, but has approved site plans. All of that was accomplished with a public investment in the roadway of only $31 million. If you could invest $31 million and get over $500 million out as a product of that investment, you would be a financial genius. But we can have that kind of return through investments in infrastructure in our communities that releases pent-up demand for folks to live near places like downtown Tallahassee, Florida State University campus, and Texas A&M. Right? All we need in place to make it possible is the infrastructure investment. The Florida Department of Transportation is facilitating some of these kinds of roadway improvements through a new approach to determining appropriate roadway design called context-sensitive classification, where the FDOT will actually look using some tools based on the urban transect at what kind of roadway design is appropriate for different places. For the first time in its history, FDOT is not using the same roadway design in downtowns that it's using in suburban or rural areas. Instead, it's recognizing that we probably need different roads in our city centers than we're using outside our city centers. And so its design guidelines should reflect that distinction. And FDOT is doing that. And this is a really great support for even for non-state roadways for your community to talk about how to improve a road based on a different classification, a context classification than perhaps it's been looked at in the past. All right, we're moving into our last couple here. We've got 2 more left in this second advanced course, and they both relate around sustainability, health, and resilience. If you look on page 21 in your packet, you'll see this sheet related to the Southeast Florida Climate Compact. And we have, I'm actually going to go through some of the supporting materials for this one in advance. We've got a lot of them. We have a 2009 interlocal agreement that created the Southeast Florida Regional Climate Compact, a 2012 analysis of sea level rise that we'll talk about in a second, a 2016 a document on integrating those sea level rise projections into local plans. Finally, 2019 unified sea level rise projections for Southeast Florida, and a 2021 interlocal agreement. Those are listed in chronological order, and I want to point out the note that we have both of the 2009 interlocal agreement and the 2021 interlocal agreement. I'm going to talk about that again in a second when I wrap this up. So the Climate Compact is an agreement between Miami-Dade County, Broward County, Palm Beach County, and Monroe County that really exists for local governments to be able to take local policy leadership on the issue of climate change at a time when in the state of Florida, statewide elected officials or even officials locally that serve in the state legislature were not uniformly taking climate change seriously. In particular, in conservative politics, I think there was concern among politicians reflecting concerns of their constituents that perhaps ideas about climate change were aggressive in their suggestion of policy changes, and so we didn't see a lot of action at the state level. The Climate Compact is a clear pushback against that, of these counties saying, we know that climate change is real. We know that it's going to have an impact on the livability of our communities and how our infrastructure functions because of sea level rise, and we want to do something about it. And the Climate Compact does this in a couple of different ways. One, the member counties develop sea level rise projections, like the one that you see here, to get a sense of and a scope of the actual problem that climate change presents to them, this practical question of what will we do when sea levels rise? By getting a baseline of factually, how bad can we expect this to be? Secondly, they pool their resources to conduct analysis like this one, where they look at key regionally significant infrastructure here, like the airport in Broward County, and say, if sea levels rise, how will this infrastructure be impacted? How will water leave the site after it rains? At king tides, will we have any inundation? How do we need to change how we manage this facility or make physical changes to this facility in response to climate change? And again, the impetus for this is happening at the local level because we didn't have leadership at the state level. Here's some examples, not necessarily related to the Climate Compact, but looking specifically at what one city, Miami Beach, has done to address this issue. Miami Beach has been proactive in developing new sources of revenue locally to manage stormwater in the light of sea level rise, because in Miami Beach, at times of extreme high tides, water travels out of the storm sewers backwards and floods streets in some parts of the community. And that's obviously an untenable situation. And Miami Beach is dealing with it literally by raising streets in the community so that they are higher above sea level and therefore less prone to flooding. So these are some photographs I took of some construction on Miami Beach streets to address this problem. In the image on the left, you'll notice I'm standing in front of a building in private space in front of a building to take this image, looking out at the public street, which is several feet above the entryway into the building. In other words, the city raised the street and raised the sidewalk so that floodwaters would drain off of it, and created steps to go down to the private businesses below. And over time, these private businesses will need to rise as well. But this project took care of the public space. Some more examples of what that looks like. I think the image on the right is pretty clear what's happening. You've got the private space on the right and the roadway on the left. In the image on the left, you see folks walking on a public sidewalk. And then it's a little bit more difficult to tell, but there's a seating area in front of a restaurant submerged down to the left. I want to, before we leave this, talk a little bit about the difference between that 2009 interlocal agreement and 2021 agreement, and move from talking about the Climate Compact just in terms of this way of addressing climate change to what excites me about it as a land use lawyer. And that is that the Climate Compact isn't a regional governmental organization created by the state or created by the federal government. It's really created by a partnership between the member counties. And if you look at the 2009 interlocal agreement, it's a very bare bones document that essentially says, we're going to collaborate for these purposes to address climate change. And it's very short, right? It's aspirational, it's looking forward to the future, and it doesn't have a lot of details in terms of creating a bureaucratic organization. If you look at the 2021 document, 12 years later, the Climate Compact has gotten grants, has done a lot of work, has seen the need to expend funds on things like planning, like developing those sea level rise projections, and has really figured out where it's useful and where it is not useful. And as a result, in that 2021 document, planning for the Climate Compact is much more robust and much more complicated. It's a very long document that covers all kinds of things, from how the compact is going to be funded to how it relates in lawsuits or managing employees, et cetera. And that distinction between a nascent organization and a more mature organization, I think, is a really interesting one. Again, because this is a regional body that is created by member organizations, not by the state government. And so we're really seeing something birthed and coming into its own in a comparison of those two interlocal agreements. All right, I believe urban agriculture is our last one on page 22 before we move on into our second advanced course. Urban agriculture really is an exciting thing that's happening in planning right now. And I want to start talking about it by giving an introduction to some state laws that deal with farming in the state of Florida. Of all land uses, farming holds a really special deferential view in state government. Farming is essential to a way of life in the state of Florida, from honoring citrus on our license plates, or having citrus be part of our identity, to looking at ranching and cattle as part of our identity and history. Farming is really essential to who we are. But at the same time, farms can be a nuisance. Farms make noise, farms smell, and that contrast has given farms a special place in Florida law, where both state law protects farms from nuisance actions and exempts farm buildings from having to meet code, both building code regulations and local government land use and zoning regulations, so that a farmer putting up a feed shed doesn't need to go through the same building code processes that we would to construct a building that was going to be used for human habitation. That's might make sense in a context like what we see in this picture, right? That might make sense on our historical concept of what a farm is. It doesn't make sense when we start to talk about where farming is going in some places in the future, which is more towards urban agriculture. Urban agriculture is things like as simple as home gardens and community gardens to things as complex as rooftop gardens, or even commercial hydroponics, or agri-hoods, which are neighborhoods that are developed around farming as a chief amenity for a neighborhood. It's looking at more and more integration of farm type land uses closer and closer to where people live and integrated more into their daily lives. And in this context, the state law protections for farming don't really make nearly as much sense. If we have farming in an urban area, do we really want to exempt it from nuisance lawsuits, right? If a farm in an urban area makes noise or smells, should the neighbors be able to complain? What if we build a building that is on an urban farm only a few dozen feet from a residential building? Should we be concerned with how safe it is, whether it's prone to fire or collapse? What happens to it in a big storm? All of a sudden, these exemptions that we've made for agriculture in a rural context don't really make as much sense. And that can make local governments afraid to have urban agriculture in their jurisdictions. As an elected official, I wouldn't want to allow farms in urban areas of my jurisdiction if I knew we were going to have outcomes like people not being able to shut down a smelly farm or a chicken operation next door, right? We have to be able to address these problems. And the state is finally looking at this in some changes to state law, where it's distinguishing between traditional rural farms or traditional farms on rural land and emerging trends towards urban agriculture, and recognizing that these beneficial exemptions in the law for urban agriculture maybe don't apply in urban areas. If you look again on page 22 in your books and look at the read more options, what I've included there is a law that was adopted this year in 2021 that includes some of this removal of deferential treatment for urban agriculture. And secondly, a UF IFAS publication on establishing an urban agricultural ordinance. That's a great template document. If you're in your community and you want to promote urban agriculture, there's an ordinance template included in that UF IFAS document that's available to you there in the read more section. So that's it for our overview of emerging ideas and trends in urban and regional planning. We're going to pick up on some new ideas in our second advanced course in a minute. Welcome to the second advanced course. I want to introduce the second advanced course by talking a little bit about how it compares to the first advanced course. So in the first advanced course, we really focused on policy. So we talked a lot about what some of the big ideas in planning are, that are the current events that planners and other people that deal with land use regulation are concerned with, and how you might deal with them as elected officials through some practical policy approaches. In this second course, it's a little bit different. We're talking about some advanced tools that exist mostly under Florida state law, but not exclusively under Florida state law, and how they impact development approval processes. So this is looking at processes and strategies on kind of either a big picture level or really sort of a specialized level. And we've got three subtopics that we're going to go through, and I want to introduce them really quickly so that as we go through, you can track these. The first one is dealing with large scale planning. So what are some processes and strategies for dealing with really big pieces of land? The second is talking about infrastructure funding. How do we fund the capital infrastructure we need to support our communities, from fire stations to affordable housing to roads? And then finally, what are some processes and strategies that can be beneficial specifically to small counties, which are very often, and I mean small in population, not in area or in cultural or community significance, but small in population, and therefore may be economically constrained or without the ability to generate revenue or economic development in the same way as the bigger population centers in our state. So let's jump right in and start talking about planning processes and strategies for large scale planning. The first one that I want to touch on is something called the Collier County RLSA. RLSA stands for Rural Land Stewardship Area. I often pronounce this RLSA though. Generally, I avoid using acronyms because they frustrate everybody, but RLSA, it's kind of fun to say. So you might hear me say the Collier County RLSA every now and then. But when I do, I'm referring to the Rural Land Stewardship Area. Oftentimes in planning, and especially approvals for large projects, we look at development considerations over a very long time period. And the RLSA is no example. Collier County has been dealing with this as a planning issue for decades. And I've got this timeline up here that goes back to 1997. I want to touch on it a little bit. And I want to, as I do that, reference the read more list. If you want to follow along in your book, the tear sheet for the Collier County Rural Land Stewardship Area is on page 24. So the tear sheet is on page 24. Way back in 1997, Collier County amended its comprehensive plan and provided for development in this area of the county that's covered by the Rural Land Stewardship Area. I'm going to show some maps in a minute. So if you want to get a sense of where this is geographically, we're going to get there. But I want to start kind of talking about this sort of legal history. The state of Florida and some other parties were involved in a challenge to that comprehensive plan amendment. And in 1997, the Administration Commission found that a comprehensive plan update to be not in compliance. If you remember in our introduction, when we talked about the Growth Management Act requiring a few things of local government plans, one is that local plans be in compliance with state law. This is an instance where the state found that a local plan was not in compliance with state law. So that language there, not in compliance, has a specific meaning in this context. If you're not aware also, I want to tell you what the Administration Commission is. The Administration Commission is the governor and the cabinet sitting together. So actually, this was a group of folks chaired by Jeb Bush that made this decision that the Collier County plan was not in compliance. But it wasn't a political decision. They were applying state law to the county plan to determine whether the county plan met those standards. So back to the read more list, the first document that you have there is the 1999 Administration Commission Final Order, which is laid the groundwork for what's happened in subsequent decades. The Administration Commission told Collier County, you need to change your comprehensive plan in some significant ways. And that original document is there in your backup. Then in 2002, so 3 years later, the county adopted the Rural Land Stewardship Area provisions as a remedial amendment, meaning they addressed these problems with their comprehensive plan 3 years later in 2002. Throughout the next couple of decades, lots of folks have viewed how development has happened in that area over time and offered critiques. And in particularly in the 2010s, some interest groups that are concerned with the quality of development in the area, including 1,000 Friends of Florida, the Conservancy of Southwest Florida, and Smart Growth America, critiqued the program. And I'll talk about the interests of each one of those as I kind of talk about the geographic context for the area. And then in 2020, just last year, the county published proposed amendments to the Rural Land Stewardship Area rules to update them based on things that it had learned in the last 20 years. The last time I checked, Collier County had not yet adopted those updates yet. So they weren't law, they were still proposed, but that may have changed. It's been a few months since I did the research that led me to put together this PowerPoint presentation and the documents that you have in your packet. But in any case, I expect that these rule changes will be forthcoming. Also in the backup to your packet are some of those recent documents. There's a 2019 report from 1,000 Friends of Florida giving a summary of the RLSA and critiques of it. There's a white paper that the county adopted in 2019 critiquing its program. And then there's those 2020 rule revisions that the county has drafted, but as of the last time I had checked, not yet adopted. Okay, so what is the Rural Land Stewardship Area? Now that we kind of know what the timeline is, well, what the heck is the thing? This might make a whole lot more sense if I answer that question. First, I want to give you a map of Collier County. My mouse is not working here, so I can't wiggle. Let me use my other input device here. This is a map of Collier County. This is actually the future land use map from Collier County's comprehensive plan. Collier County is on the southwest Florida coastline. So this is a shore over here with the Gulf of Mexico. The urbanized area is in the northern shoreline. We've got cities like Naples over here, and then we start to transition south into the Everglades. We've got Everglades over here. This boundary over here, I believe on the south is coterminous with Monroe County, and then over here, probably Broward, or maybe even Miami-Dade. I don't know my geography well enough to tell the answer to that, I'm embarrassed to say. But historically, most of our urban development has been over in the western part of the county, close to the shore. We have this flag of land in the northern central part of the county that's not Everglades, so it's not parkland. It's primarily used for agriculture, and it has some rural communities that have been there for a long time, like Immokalee, which is a place where lots of farm workers and laborers live because of the surrounding farmland. Lots of interest groups and folks are interested in this particular land. And I'm not an expert on this, but I can give you a few reasons why. One is we've got an important Florida panther habitat. Florida panther is an endangered species, and lots of folks are concerned about the well-being of the Florida panther, and therefore concerned about any land where the Florida panther might live. Secondly, this is really important land for water quality. Lots of water is here that flows down into the Everglades. that affects the water quality of Everglades. And so we're concerned about water quality in this area and therefore concerned about how much development happens in this area. Finally, agriculture is a really important land use in the state of Florida, and how much productive agricultural land we have matters. A lot of folks back when that 1997 plan adoption, when the county adopted that 1997 plan amendment, were concerned that too much land would be consumed by development allowed in this area, and we would lose access to that productive farmland. So lots of different competing interests running up against two things, really. Collier County's recognition that populations are growing, and so we need to have land uses that accommodate new land for people to live on. And two, the property owners that own this land saw a long-term change of the land from rural and agricultural to urban, so that they would have be able to put it to what they saw as a higher and better use, at least from a financial perspective, if not from a social or environmental perspective. So let's look specifically at a map of that flag area there. Here is a 2017 map of the rural land stewardship area. I'm going to switch back and forth just so you can compare these. Here in the center of this area are the city limits for Immokalee. Let's go back. Here's Immokalee here. So when we flip back and forth between these, you can see that these are the same geographic areas overlaid. What's happening in the rural land stewardship area is the county's making some strategic plans to allow for development of this area while simultaneously protecting the other uses of land other than urban development, like panther habitat, productive agriculture, and free-flowing water. And they're doing that by trying to identify the areas that are most valuable for staying in an undeveloped state, the lands that are most useful for being urbanized, and taking the development potential for the entire area and directing it to those areas appropriate for urban development while getting conservation easements over the other areas. I said a lot right there. So let me break it down a little bit in the next couple of slides. But what you can see specifically on this diagram are, sorry, without my mouse, I'm a little confused here, are distinguishing between those areas that are appropriate for urban development. Like here, for example, the city of Ave Maria, it's not an incorporated city, but the urban area of Ave Maria, where Ave Maria University is located, identified as a growth area. And for example, in the eastern side of this image, an area of critical state concern, where we're most concerned with water quality and habitat. This diagram comes from a planner named Randall Arendt, who really advocates for a concept called clustered development, wherein places are developed, rural land is developed but not with just low density development. Instead, growth is targeted to certain areas, and areas that are not appropriate for growth are targeted for conservation. And on the whole, you get the same amount of urban development on an aggregate piece of land, but distribute it in a very different way than we would if we just had, for example, low density housing spread across a landscape. And in this diagram, he kind of shows that. Instead of having, say, housing on 2 acres apiece scattered evenly or uniformly across this landscape, let's cluster the housing with maybe some mixed use or commercial development in the center and conserve the land around it for environmental purposes or agricultural productivity purposes. This diagram represents that. It's kind of a mixed use hamlet in the countryside. And if I don't say myself, if I say so myself, it looks a little bit more idyllic than if it was just housing on, say, 2 acre lots. The purpose of doing something like this is to allow the same total population growth and the same economic development, but in a way that conserves the agricultural productivity and environmental productivity. This is a statement that the planning department for Collier County made in 2002 to the Collier County Commission, where they specifically state that the rural land stewardship area overlay, or these policies in the Collier County Comprehensive Plan, will achieve these clustered development goals. We're not increasing population. We're not increasing development potential, But instead of allowing development to spread checkerboard across the land, we're going to focus it into certain areas, move it around, reallocate it, if you will, in order to also be able to preserve the agricultural productivity and environmental benefits of the overall area. One thing that you'll see if you take the time to read some of the critiques that have come out in the 2010s of the program is that the mechanisms put in place to achieve this outcome could be very complicated, and in some places have actually led to an increase in overall density. So for how these processes work through something called a transfer of development rights program, where a property owner who doesn't develop land with urban development is compensated for putting a conservation easement on the land and essentially relinquishes development credits or rights to build land. And those credits or rights are sold to a company or landowner that does the more dense housing development elsewhere in the rural land stewardship area. So there's a financial transfer from folks who build more densely to folks who don't build at all. So it's a market-driven transfer of development rights program that's designed to achieve these outcomes of getting both of the benefits of growth and development while maintaining the benefits of agricultural productivity and environmental conservation. All right, let's talk about the St. Joe sector plan. So the rural land stewardship area that we just talked about is provided in state law and is a tool that exists for large-scale planning. Likewise, sector plans are a tool that exists in state law and are tools for large-scale planning. If you have ever heard the term development of regional impact, starting in the 1970s when Florida became a growth management state, really until the mid to late 2000s, Florida was using a regulatory tool called the development of regional impact in order to do large-scale planning. We no longer create new developments of regional impact. Some still exist that were permitted in prior decades, but that tool no longer exists in state law for new projects going forward. Instead, we have the sector plan. I'm going to talk about what a sector plan is using the example of the St. Joe sector plan. So if you're following along, you want to be on page 25 in your booklet. We're looking at a sector plan that straddles Bay County and Walton County. And the three documents that you have in your read more section are a 2014 application to Bay County for the sector plan. Because it's in two counties, we have applications for both. And I've just selected documents from Bay County. We have policies that are in the Bay County Comprehensive Plan for the sector plan. And we have a 2020 application for something called a Detailed Specific Special Area Plan. I'll talk about that in a second. I've got the cover pages here just for your reference, so you can get a sense of these as separate things. One, an application to Bay County for a sector plan, and two, an application to Bay County for a detailed specific area plan. These are such funny terms. They shouldn't make any sense to you, but I'm gonna try to explain them and put a little bit more flesh on this idea here in a second. Before I get to those distinctions, I want to put a little bit of this in fiscal or business context for you. The applicant for this sector plan and for the detailed specific area plan is a company called St. Joe, the St. Joe Company, that is a publicly traded company. You can buy and sell stock in the St. Joe Company. As a result, it's governed by Securities and Exchange Act regulations that require it to make public reporting. In its 2021 Form K, which is, I'm not a securities attorney, but I know that Form K is a document that publicly traded companies have to publish making disclosures about their financial position. We have lots of discussion from the St. Joe Company about land use law in Florida. This is really significant to me for two reasons. The first one is very personal. I'm a planning dork and a land use law dork. And so when I see the things that make me excited in my professional life reiterated in a Form 10K, I get giddy and excited. But secondly, it really emphasizes how significant the land use rules that you deal with every day are in some cases for big business. They really matter for their bottom line. They're really paying attention to them. And that's one reason that these are some of the most difficult issues that you deal with as an elected official. You get lobbied on them, they're complicated, and you have to make tough decisions. This is in part why. So what the St. Joe Company says in its Form 10K is that this sector plan is really essential to its well-being as a company, right? To its future revenues. This really matters because the document gives it the right to develop over 170,000 residential units. Think about that. Even if the average people per household is only 3, we're talking about more than 500,000 people residing in this sector plan area over time. And think about that in the context of the largest cities in the state. The largest city population-wise in the state is Jacksonville. Of course, it's not the biggest metropolitan area. That would probably be down towards Miami-Dade, Broward, maybe even Palm Beach, depending on how those MSAs are defined. But the single city with the largest population is Jacksonville. And the last census numbers that I saw were about 860,000 for Jacksonville. Those may be larger with the 2020 census. I haven't seen recent numbers, but at 500,000 people, again, assuming 3 people per unit, we're talking a lot of folks in this area. So they've got the right to build that many residential units and all this retail, all this industrial space, all these hotel rooms. And this is really significant for the bottom line of this company. And then even more discussion on the process of seeking entitlements like this under Florida law. And I'm going to read this quote here because this is just so important. Approval to develop real property in Florida entails an extensive entitlements process, which you know from how much time you spend on them. And as county commissioners, you're only one part of the process, involving multiple and overlapping regulatory jurisdictions, requiring discretionary action by local governments, which means that you're in the decision seat. Your decisions aren't automatic or guaranteed. The process is often political, uncertain, and may require significant exactions in order to secure approvals. Exactions, as we learned in the last course, the first course, not the first advanced course, but the first growth management course, are things that you could require a developer to do, like build roads or give land and easements for power line transmission, et cetera. And that the decisions, the real estate development project decisions, must generally comply with a local government comprehensive plan and land development regulations and state law. And getting through all that is usually a lengthy and costly process. So you're not the only ones that are invested in this. Your applicants are. And one point that I want to underscore here is that the big risk that the St. Joe Company identifies is not necessarily that they'll be told yes or no, but that there's uncertainty. And that I think as local government officials, the best way that we can be supportive of industry, if that's something that we aspire to, is not by always saying yes, but by being consistent. And even if we say no sometimes for the public benefit or public good, doing that in a way that's consistent and predictable, so that folks know when they make applications what their outcome is going to be. They don't have a lot of risk. Risk is the big enemy of sound economic investment, not the possibility, not just the fact that sometimes you can't do what you want to do, but uncertainty as to whether you can do something. Okay, so now back to sector plans and exactly what they are. Let's get into a little bit more detail. They happen in 2 steps. The first step is the sector planning step. It's called creation of a long-term master plan. I'm going to show you the maps of the long-range master plan for Walton County. And again, if you look through those read more documents, you'll see not only these maps, but hundreds of pages of text that accompanied them. So in the this again is a document, sorry, a geographic area that straddles Bay and Walton County. You can see the dividing line between the 2 counties here. The distance from east to west in this image is huge. It's 30 miles. Interestingly, a lot of the development that we talked about in case study 1 is mentioned here. Rosemary Beach, Seaside, Alice Beach, those developments that we talked about are all in this area. Panama City Beach is this area. So we've been looking at pictures from this area quite a lot in our presentations. So we're talking about a very, very big area. and what's in the lighter color green is proposed to be developed as part of the sector plan. But not all of it would be developed. We've got a couple of land uses identified here on a very big scale. For example, we've got rights of way identified for roads that would traverse the entire planning area. We've got dark colored areas that would be long-term conservation. And we've got lighter orange areas that they define as a land use category called village center, and darker red areas that they define as town center with more intense development. So they're at a big picture landscape level talking about when they build these 170,000 residential units, how the land use categories would be divided between conservation and preservation versus development versus where major infrastructure would go. So very big picture planning decisions being made in the sector planning process. Here's another map as part of that application showing the same area and identifying what some of the major roadway types would be that are built in those big planning areas. Okay, so once that sector plan is adopted, and it has been, we have that sector plan adopted as law in Walton and Bay County. It's part of those counties' comprehensive plans. A second set of decisions comes afterward. Now, a sector planning decision to adopt a long-term master plan, that's legislative. And you remembered in your first course what that legislative decision-making process looks like. It's generally only judged by courts using that deferential, fairly debatable standard. This means you can say no if you want, and it's subject to this process for compliance with state law. Once that plan exists, however, more detailed land development decisions are made through something called a detail-specific area planning process. And these are, as the name implies, more detailed. These are going to be quasi-judicial decisions. And if you remember from that very first course, that means that you're bound to approve them if the application meets the standards, and you're required to deny them if the application doesn't meet the standards. Right? So a very different kind of decision on your part as elected officials. If we look, this area that's here in this more orangish color, coral, would you call that coral, is the entire sector planning area that's 30 miles wide. If you look in the center towards the bottom, we see something in this blue hash. That's the Ward Creek DSAP boundary, DSAP standing for Detailed Specific Area Plan. And we're looking at an application to have our detailed specific development proposal for just that area. Let's look at that map. It's this. So if you recall in the last image, we're looking massively at a landscape level for an area that's 30 miles across. Here in these more detailed images, we've got very specific neighborhood level roadways, and you can even start to see where individual lots would go along these roadways for development. We've even got, some sort of cul-de-sacs and other closes at the end of these streets. So a much fine-grained level of detail. I want to have one last note on this before we leave the sector plan. I was looking through these slides with Eric Poole just a minute ago of the Institute for County Government. And he said, oh, I worked on that. And I was in the private sector as a planner. And I said, oh, Eric, how long ago was that? I thought you'd been at the Florida Association of Counties for a long time. And he said, oh, I've been here 19 years. So he was working on this sector plan 20 years ago. These decisions are in play for very, very, very long periods of time, just like what we looked at with the Collier County Rural Land Stewardship Area. Long lead times to these decisions, and lots of folks work on them across decades, which of course makes sense when you're building a development that could house a population the size of a very, very large Florida city. All right, let's move on. North Ranch Sector Plan. This is the third and final item in our large scale planning series. The North Ranch Sector Plan, just like the Bay Walton County Sector Plan, is a sector plan, meaning it was subject to that two-part adoption process of the long-term master plan and the detailed specific area plan. I believe that no DSAPs have been proposed for this area. You might also know this area as the Deseret Ranch Sector Plan. A lot of times it's referred to it that way in popular media articles, and there have been quite a few articles about the development of this area. It's a cattle ranch that has business relationship with the Mormon Church, and it's a big piece of property with large institutional ownership is another way to look at it. To get a sense of what we're talking about geographically, we've got the city of Orlando and Orange County up here to the northwest, Kissimmee down here, and then between Kissimmee and St. Cloud and the satellite beach area between the coast over here, we've got lots of land that's currently vacant. What's in red here is the North Ranch area. It's the land that's the subject of that North Ranch sector plan. Here's what that looks like from the air. You can see this is the super urbanized development that's in Orlando and south of Orlando. Here's the Orlando International Airport here. The parks are over in this area over here. That's not a high enough resolution photo for me to identify them, but here's where our theme parks are. And then of course you've got a lot of urban development on the coast, but in between, not a whole lot happening. If you've ever driven the turnpike from South Florida up to Orlando, you've got this great big stretch in the heartland of Florida, one of the heartlands of Florida with not a lot of development. This is land that we're talking about. And this massive piece here is under common ownership here. It's the North Ranch Sector Plan. What's significant in talking about this property that's a reason to talk about it in addition to the Bay County, Walton County plan is the coordinated planning that's been happening between the property owner and the state of Florida, and specifically the Florida Department of Transportation. The state has been very proactive in planning future transportation corridors in this area to talk about where it will place new turnpikes or new limited access roadways, connecting the metropolitan Orlando area with the coastal areas in Brevard County. These two maps come from a document that's one of your read more documents. Let me give you the name of it so you've got it accessible if you're following along on page 26 of your report. It's called the 2014 FDOT East Central Florida Corridor Task Force Report. It includes these maps of general areas where the state might build new limited access highways or freeways, essentially. It's got a couple of corridors that are running east to west here in this image on the left. They're labeled F and D. And then corridors that are running north and south, identified here in the right, most significantly as Corridor I. What's interesting about those is the land that they traverse is perfectly overlapped with that North Ranch sector plan property. And if we look at the maps that were submitted to Osceola County as part of the application process for the sector plan, development proposals are included that anticipate those FDOT corridors. So this east-west roadway, this north-south roadway, and also this roadway, which is in the area, I believe, of letter H in the previous maps, overlap. Let's go look at those again. FDOT planning for new corridors in the area, the applicant's proposals for how the sector plan would develop the North Ranch area. I think that matters from a planning perspective because it allows us to get a window into how long-term planning can help us coordinate provision of infrastructure with conversion of land from rural to urban development. No matter how you feel about conversion of that ranch land to urban development, it certainly is going to be the best outcome that it could be. Something that's necessary for it to be the best outcome that it could be is planning for transportation infrastructure that's owned by the public sector at the time that we're planning for the land development that's done by the private sector. And this is exactly how that process is being done to coordinate those two things in the case of the Deseret Ranch area. All right, now, I know we've had that little introduction to how land use planning and infrastructure are coordinated. I want to talk about two sort of advanced ways to think about funding infrastructure using the impact fee model. So we're going to have two case studies in this funding infrastructure section. We're moving now to page 28, mobility fee in your packet. And we're going to have a second one here called linkage fees. I want to give a refresher on what impact fees are before we get into talking about mobility fees. I don't have a slide for this, but if you look on page 28, where I have this introduction to mobility fees, I have this language here. I'm going to read it and share with you what it is. And this is a refresher from our very, very first course in land use law for Florida elected officials. A mobility fee is an impact fee, and therefore mobility fees must meet the dual rational nexus test. The dual rational nexus test is our test for determining the legal validity of an impact fee. And the dual rational nexus test requires two things. First, there must be a connection between a burden the development places on a public service and the fee a developer pays. So we know that development burdens public services, right? When we develop land, we need to serve more houses with our fire departments. We need to put more school children in public schools. We need to have more roads, and those roads need to carry a higher capacity of traffic. We may need new transit services, new public parks. The all public infrastructure is scalable to the amount of population and developed land we have in a community. Often, interestingly, generally more closely related to the amount of land that's developed than to how many people actually live on it, right? Because water pipe doesn't serve a certain number of houses, it serves a certain distance, right? So an impact fee must have a relationship between that burden the development places on the community and the amount that the developer pays for their fee. Second, the public expenditure of that fee revenue, when government actually spends any revenue that it collects from an impact fee, it has to benefit the development. So we can't take money from development on the east side of the county and use it to build a road on the west side of the county. We have to collect money from developers because they impact the community, but then spend it to provide infrastructure that benefits the development. It's got to be a benefit coming in, going, benefit to the county, benefit back to the developer and spending. Those are the rules for our impact fee. Now let's talk about mobility fees, which are a kind of impact fee for transportation. A mobility fee differs from a traditional road impact fee in that it measures the impact of development to multiple transportation modes, like walking, biking, riding transit, and then anticipates funding those multiple modes of transportation. A traditional road impact fee just looks at how much a development will impact roads, but doesn't really think about those other transportation modes like transit, walking, or bike riding. And a mobility fee takes into account that people move about in different ways. And that if we actually plan for folks to move about in different ways by providing different kinds of infrastructure, then people will have more choices than just driving. Mobility fee has this at the outset. Well, so what are some examples of these other transportation modes, right? Well, one, we could have mixed use paths for bike riding, right? This is a mixed use path in the city of Gainesville on a converted rail line. It gets lots of traffic. This is a story to reflect how old I am. I jog on this path quite a bit because it's near my home and I see lots of other people exercising, but not a lot of commuters. Recently, I stayed out after dark, which is something that as a middle-aged person with a toddler, I don't do very often. But I did recently and took this trail home. I was, about a quarter mile from my house having a beer with some friends and took the trail home. And I passed lots of people that were commuting on it. Young people that looked like they were coming home from work at about 8 o'clock at night or coming home from school at about that time or getting ready to go out with friends. And there was actually more traffic of that nature than I normally see when I use this as a jogging path. So when these facilities exist, they're very well used. The image on the right is actually a bus station. I won't call it a bus stop because it's much nicer than that, in Eugene, Oregon, where they've really invested a lot in having a premium bus service. It's a kind of bus service that's commonly called bus rapid transit because it's an attempt to make a bus system feel more like a rail system. And by actually having nice, convenient stations that are comfortable to be at, that are located further apart than traditional bus stops, so the bus is able to travel a greater distance between stops. And they've actually, the bus that's in the right-hand side of that image is augmented, so it's got sliding doors that open level with the transit station. So instead of climbing up steps to get on the bus, you just walk on level like you would at a train station. It's actually striking how much nicer of an experience that makes. Now, if we're thinking about these kinds of transportation innovations, and we want to fund them with an impact fee, you can't use a traditional road impact fee. You have to do something a little bit more complicated. Here's some more examples. Here's an RTS bus on the University of Florida campus here in Gainesville. The image on the right is for the Miami Metro rail station near the Miami airport. Next time you fly in or out of Miami, definitely take the Metro. It's a great way to travel around Miami-Dade County. But again, you cannot fund infrastructure like this. So as additional examples, this bus on the left is a RTS bus in the city of Gainesville on the University of Florida campus. This transit system moves millions and millions of passengers every year, passenger trips a year. It's not necessarily unique individual riders, but offers millions of trips a year that take thousands of automobile trips a day off the local road network. The image on the right is a Metro rail station in Miami, Florida. It's the one at the Miami International Airport. Right, it takes infrastructure in order to provide these kinds of services. And the one way that local governments get revenue to build infrastructure is through impact fees. A traditional road-oriented impact fee is not going to be able to build this kind of infrastructure, but a mobility fee can. Let's move. So some benefits of mobility fees, and then we'll move into a specific example. Is that, again, as I've been emphasizing, mobility fees can fund projects that improve mobility, but not just make it easier to drive. And secondly, and really more significantly, is if your local government wants to encourage development, if your county wants to encourage development that supports walking, is more urban development, a mobility fee approach can actually allow you to charge the development that is walkable or in a walkable location a lower fee than development that is driving dependent, because it's very often cheaper to provide these kinds of transit solutions and walking and biking solutions than it is to provide driving solutions. So these are two real strategic benefits of mobility fees and reasons why they're increasing in popularity amongst Florida local governments. This is an approach that's promoted by the Florida legislature. All right, so we have a legislature, and this comes from 2011 amendments to the law that says, we should be planning to have a secondary priority on vehicle mobility and a primary emphasis on ensuring a safe, comfortable, and attractive pedestrian environment. But that's actually a goal that the state of Florida added to the statutes on comprehensive planning in the 2011 amendments. And one way they're going to do this is to reduce impact fees or local access fees to promote development within urban areas, in multimodal transportation districts that balance mixed-use development in appropriate areas. So the legislature is really looking at this connection between land use development and transportation and promoting the kinds of ideas that a mobility fee concept promotes. Okay, so now our specific example. If you look at your read more section, the documents that I provided you there, the first one is a 2009 report by the Center for Urban Transportation Research at the University of South Florida, where Cutter looks at the mobility fee concept from a high level when we were just beginning to adopt these in the state of Florida. Then subsequent documents are from the mid 2010s. I think they're all from 2015. We're going to look at them now. They all relate to a mobility fee that that Sarasota County has adopted. So these next couple of slides that we'll look at are not the images that I produced, but are images from those Sarasota County documents, really explaining and representing the mobility fee concept. So for example, in this image here that we're looking at, the documentation supporting the Sarasota County mobility fee underlined this connection between land use and transportation, and that the kind of infrastructure that we build will help people move around in different ways. And we've got an image here where we're really emphasizing that you can allocate roadway space to ample sidewalks, to bike lanes, to on-street parking, and maybe transit facilities, and have a minority of the space available for folks who are driving automobiles. A big change from how we've thought about transportation in recent generations in the state of Florida. But it also shows something about the buildings that are adjacent here, that this also comes with a certain urban design context. Buildings built up to the sidewalk and probably more dense development that you would see in an urban area. This is probably the kind of thing and roadway facility that's most appropriate for one of our more urban transect zones, to look back at that analogy for form-based codes. A discussion of the complete streets concept. The text associated with the slide is just absolutely great. It says, you know what, if we're not willing to tolerate the automobile congestion that's become a way of life in a lot of Florida communities, we need to recognize that the same old solutions, namely building more and wider roadways, are not going to solve that problem. If we want to fix this congestion problem, we're going to need a drastic solution, which is rethinking land use patterns and how transportation is related to land use patterns. And both the form-based code concepts we talked about in the last advanced course and these newer transportation infrastructure funding models we're talking about here are related to that. Next, and if you want to learn more, of course, you can read all those Sarasota County documents, which are included in your backup. The next concept I want to talk about is linkage fees. Like mobility fees, linkage fees are an impact fee. So this is a charge to someone who develops real estate at the time that they develop the real estate. And it must meet those two requirements of the dual rational nexus test, right? The development must be causing a burden on public infrastructure, and local governments have to be spending that fee revenue in order to provide that infrastructure that benefits that specific development project. But linkage fees relate specifically to affordable housing. So a local government can actually charge a linkage fee, this kind of impact fee, to developers whose projects increase the demand for affordable housing. And again, this is something that the Florida legislature explicitly allows in Florida statutes. And this comes from another recent change to Florida statutes, even more recent than 2011. I think well, we've had a lot of references to affordable housing funding in state law for some time. I think the specific reference to linkage fees might be as recent as the last 2 or 3 years. But a county can adopt and maintain in effect any law, rule, or ordinance that's adopted for the purpose of increasing the supply of affordable housing using mechanisms including linkage fees. So we've got to meet our dual rational nexus test. We've already covered that. For our specific example, I want to look at this, a Broward County ordinance. You've got in your backup information on this Broward County ordinance, but also a Florida Housing Coalition one sheet that explains linkage fees and a 2015 ordinance from the city of Jupiter. The reason that I want to focus on Broward County's approach is because they have a very detailed essential nexus study where they've essentially put forward the argument, the data, and the math showing that their linkage fee would meet that dual rational nexus test, which is very important because if you're going to charge a fee that has to meet the dual rational nexus test, you need to be generating that data on the front end to have a good basis in law that you're meeting those standards that exist in state law for charging an impact fee. So here's the basic overview of this. And I'm not going to go in extreme detail. I'm not an affordable housing expert, even though I am a planner. It's an expertise that I don't have, but we can give the brief overview of how Broward County is proposed to do this in its essential nexus study. First, it measures the employment density of land. So it looks at how many workers per square foot of development exist in the jurisdiction. And it separates out the different occupations. And we can get data like this from the American Community Survey from the Census Bureau to determine what portion of that workforce is earning an income that's going to require those workers to demand affordable housing, right? Because we look at the affordability of housing as a portion of income. So this kind of analysis can tell us per amount of development, how many workers are there demanding affordable housing. Then we can do math essentially to determine how many workers demanding affordable housing will come with new development. So for example, if we have 100,000 square feet of development of big box retail, we can do the math to get an estimate of the number of employees that will work there that will demand affordable housing and get a sense of how many affordable housing units will be created by the construction of that commercial use. So specifically tying the impact of non-residential development on the demand for houses, because employment is a link there, to see what kind of new capital infrastructure and affordable housing should come with that new commercial development. And that's essentially, in its most basic form, how a linkage fee works. But I want to give an important caveat here. Even though Florida statutes explicitly allow local governments to adopt things like linkage fees, and there's other affordable housing tools that folks can adopt, something called inclusionary zoning, where residential development has to have a portion of the development adopted dedicated to affordable housing. If local governments do that, they have to provide an offset. So here's a quote from Florida statutes that says, if you've got a linkage fee, a county must provide incentives to fully offset all costs to the developer of its affordable housing contribution or linkage fee. Right? So for example, if you charge a linkage fee to a developer, you have to turn around and also give that developer something like a density or an intensity bonus. That's an incentive that helps them earn the money that would offset what they've put out towards that linkage fee. You could reduce or waive other fees, such as other impact fees or sewer charges, or you could give other incentives, maybe like a community redevelopment agency, tax increment financing benefit, or some other grant or benefit that offsets the cost of the linkage fee. So even though they're explicitly allowed, there's a trick. You have to use some of your other tools to pay for it and make the developer whole. All right. We're down to our last two ideas that I want to talk about here. We're moving into our third subject area, which is looking at small counties. Again, this is not small in geography, but small in population, which we know are counties that are predominantly agricultural and may have fewer options for economic development than counties with large populations. The first concept we're going to talk about is agritourism. If you're following along in the report, we're looking at page 31, where our one sheet is. And we have 3 documents that will teach you more about agritourism on the Read More section. And those are all joint publications of the University of Florida and IFAS, which is the Institute of Food and Agricultural Sciences, related to how agritourism brings economic development in communities. So I'm going to give an overview as to what agritourism is and some of the basic concepts, and maybe we can leave some of the nuts and bolts of how a small county can pursue these ideas to those Read More sections. All right, so what is agritourism? Basically, the idea is that small counties, why they may have fewer options for economic development than large counties, the opportunities they have for economic development lie in their unique strengths, right? So environmental assets that are more likely to exist in smaller population counties are economic resources. So we've got nature-based tourism activities like eco safaris, scuba diving, kayaking, that can be economic engines while also, in a sense, protecting the goose that laid the golden egg, right? Benefits of the county that grow jobs sustainably. So I'm going to give this example of Ichitucknee Springs here. Millions of people each year visit Florida Springs. Ichitucknee Springs, which is a state park I believe it's in Columbia County, very near the border with Suwannee County, but generates $22.7 million a year in spending in those counties, right? So tremendous economic impact, especially in a smaller county that really has a positive benefit on folks who live and work there. Those numbers come from a study from the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. These are just some examples. I happen to love Ichitucknee Springs and Santa Fe River because they're places that I spent a lot of time at growing up. So I've taken my privilege of throwing a few photos in here to show what kinds of tourist activities happen in these areas and why they're beneficial to the communities. The picture on the left are folks floating in inner tubes down the Ichitucknee River near Fort White, Florida. And these are folks who bought gas on the way to the springs, that paid to rent a tube, that paid a park entrance fee that goes towards paying a park ranger's salary. And then probably on the way home, they'll stop and get a hamburger at Bev's in High Springs, which are the best hamburgers in North Central Florida, if you don't know. And every single dollar that comes out gets recirculated in that local economy. The top right picture of those tubes hanging in that tree is a private tube rental operation near Ichitucknee Springs State Park. And then the picture on the bottom right is just a picture of how gorgeous the river is, even when there's not tourists on it, right? Other examples of ecotourism, though, can be much higher intensity uses of land, even when there's not some amazing environmental amenity. We could have things like farm to table dinners, you pick produce farms, wedding venues, or commercial event retreats that happen on rural and agricultural land. The pictures on the right-hand side of this image, on the right-hand side of this slide are images that I took at a U-Pick blueberry farm in Levy County, Florida, near the city of Williston, right? Folks had driven from Ocala, from Gainesville, and from lots of small communities in North Central Florida in order to buy expensive blueberries that the farm owner didn't even have to pay farmhands to pick, right? Because the tourists paid for the privilege of picking them. And the money adds up very quickly if you spend a day there. This is a quote from a small farmer here in Alachua County named Jane Nesbitt. She actually is no longer the owner of the farm. I should probably update my slide. A new person owns this farm, but I love this quote from Jane, so I want to include it. People come to our farm to table dinners from South Florida, Jacksonville, and the Panhandle, so they can be outdoors and dine under the stars and be close to where the food's produced. It's part of a whole experience that you can't get in the city or the suburbs. Their farm is organized as a CSA, meaning community supported agriculture, where people subscribe, essentially have a fresh produce subscription to support the farm. And Jane says, that subscription model might not be financially viable on its own, but we are able to supplement it with these other activities that allow us to pay our employees a sustainable wage and that really engage people with the land and a farm they wouldn't be able to otherwise. So these kinds of activities happening in rural and agricultural lands and conservation lands absolutely are economically viable and have a tremendous impact on communities. And the reason that I want to emphasize them is I hear this refrain from people in Gainesville that we don't want to turn into Orlando, as they see Gainesville grow and change and maybe get more traffic congestion. But when I talk to people in Newberry, what they say is we don't want to turn into Gainesville, right? People live in the size community or town that they do because they like the lifestyle that comes with it, whether it's a rural lifestyle or an urban lifestyle. And so as we look for economic development opportunities, we can find ones that are tailored to the specific beneficial attributes of every place so that they can be economically successful, have economic development and growth, but that builds on those local strengths rather than sacrifices those local strengths to become something different. All right, final topic here, aquaculture. We're shifting now to our very last page in the book, which is page 32, and talking about aquaculture, which is sea or water-based agricultural activities, or food development activities. And I want to talk about what I think is a really fascinating case study dealing with something absolutely ingenious that the city of Cedar Key has done in collaboration with researchers at the University of Florida, specifically the Conservation Clinic at the University of Florida Law School. And I want to set the framework here. The city of Cedar Key is a coastal city. And so like so many, virtually every Florida coastal city, it's a member of the National Flood Insurance Program. If you don't have local laws recognized by the National Flood Insurance Program, your property owners are not going to be able to get flood insurance on their properties, which is a problem if you're in a coastal community. And the National Flood Insurance Program requires local governments to meet certain standards in order to have them in the program. And those include standards like prohibiting people from building in a floodplain. That's why we have so many freeboard standards, for example, in coastal communities around the state of Florida, where we have to elevate structures to be safe from storms. So we've got really competing priorities in Cedar Key, because on the one hand, they absolutely need to stay in the National Flood Insurance Program so their property owners can get insured. But at the same time, Cedar Key is one of the leading producers of clams in the United States. It has a really vital aquaculture industry that's essential to the city's economy, employment, and really even the city's identity. You go to Cedar Key, they talk about their identity as a fishing village and a clamming village when they talk about the city. The reason these interests compete is if the NFIP says you cannot build in areas that are vulnerable to flooding, but you've got an aquaculture industry that's water dependent, meaning it has to be by the water, that requires you to have raceways to raise young clams, equipment to clean and sort harvested clams, things like walk-in refrigerators to store harvested clams. You've got a conflict between keeping buildings away from flood-prone areas, but still building the buildings that are essential to your economic activity where they need to be adjacent to the water. That's exactly the conflict the city of Cedar Key faced. How can we build a clamming facility on the water where it needs to be a valid aquacultural facility while not running afoul of the NFIP standards that are so essential to our well-being for the property owners in our community? And this is the solution that they came up with. I'm going to talk about it for a second. And you've got lots of background information that explains this in detail in your read more section. You've got a resolution from the city from 2016, a memorandum explaining these issues from the University of Florida in 2016, and a PowerPoint presentation from 2016 explaining these issues in more detail than I'm going into them now. First, let me talk about what a clam aquaculture facility is, so you have a little bit more of a concrete sense of why this is a problem. This is a dock in Cedar Key, right? This is a community in the Gulf Coast in Levy County. The image on the left is just a fishing dock on the landward side of the island. So amongst some mangroves, we've got docks. This image on the right-hand side, the large troughs that you see are clam raceways. So very, very small clam seeds are put in here, and we run seawater over them so they can grow and become healthy before we put them in bags and transport them into the Gulf bed. Some more raceways here, some more close-up pictures. These are things that actually circulate seawater through these raceways. So it's seawater in those. I'm going to sound like a city slicker here. I don't know the exact words. I'm going to call them troughs, but we're running seawater through these things. You can't do this away from the water. You've got to do this on a dock, over the water, or immediately adjacent to the water so you can circulate that water over it. You've also got buildings like this. It's not fancy, but it's absolutely essential to the process. It's a refrigerated building where clams that have just been harvested are stored before processing and ultimately shipping off, so that more things can happen to them as they're sold, things that aren't water dependent. This is a place they stay before that transition. Well, none of that works if you can't have the facility right on the water. And again, that creates a problem with the NFIP process. The solution is a variance. We talked in the last class about what a variance is. It's when absolute compliance with a rule would create a hardship for a property owner. A local government can allow a property owner to deviate from the rule. And so Cedar Key created a variance process for these water dependent uses from NFIP standards, so that when it's absolutely necessary to achieve a discrete and important economic development priority for the community, they had the discretion to approve these water dependent uses through a variance process. The problem was it was very labor intensive to make the factual findings that would exist for any variance, because these things are all different, and you're never going to have the same one twice. But Cedar Key did as much as it could to streamline that process by defining what the key hardships were that existed and how they related to their local ordinance and national flood insurance standards, to adopt a resolution with predetermined findings of fact, so that later on they could award variances much faster than they would if they truly did each one ad hoc. Right? So very creative solution to that uses land use law and deals with its land development regulations to support the unique attributes of its local economy. I think the moral of that long story about City of Cedar Key is that when we run into potential conflicts between these competing interests, when the rules of the federal government conflict with the needs and demands of our local economy, that doesn't need to be a dead end. We can develop creative solutions that promote local industries and protect our essential resources and comply with the law. And this unique and tailored kind of process shouldn't just be the province of larger governments that have large legal staffs. We can be creative and scrappy and do the work on a small county or small city level too. Cedar Key did it, and the way that they were able to pull it off was again through collaboration with researchers at the University of Florida. And it works. It's a success story for the community. And that's it. That's the conclusion of advanced course number 2. I hope it's been educational, and we look forward to advanced course number 3, dealing with litigation.